Hello, 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 hello. How's everyone doing out there? I want to thank you for joining us today. We have an outstanding topic today for you. Today, I'm really excited to have on Dr. Jesse Grant to talk with us about toxic masculinity. As always, I am Dr. Njay Akbar. I am the host of this show, Perspectives with Black Men, which is all about our voices, our experiences, and our solutions. And today, we are going to dive deeper into toxic masculinity. We've talked about many things on this show, and we will talk about many other things on this show coming up. And so let's dive right into it. So, Dr. Jesse Grant is a administrator and researcher in higher education with over 30 years of experience, and he currently serves as the Dean of Students at Cleveland Institute of Art. So, Dr. Grant, welcome to Perspectives.
Well, thank you for having me this evening.
Yes, thank you very much. So, if you could just start off by just sharing a little bit about yourself and letting people know who you are and why, is this topic important to you?
Okay. Well, as you said, I am currently the Dean of Students at the Cleveland Institute of Art. I have worked in student affairs at a number of institutions for the past 30 something years. And so in that, for my student experiences, I'm starting at Ohio State, then going to Kent, Iowa, and then kind of moving all over the country, Missouri, Minnesota, Alaska, back in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan. So doctorate from Western Michigan University, which is where my studies actually began in men and masculinity. Professional associations, the American College Personnel Association, Men and Masculinity group. At that point in time, it was a discussion group. We would have conversations about what this meant for us as administrators. How did this play out for us? And then a really good friend of mine, Dr. Tracy Davis, and I began to dive in and have conversations about how did that impact us from a racial lens? What were the experiences of African-American male administrators compared to white male administrators? Like, how did things show up in terms of masculinity, violence, those sorts of things. And sexuality as well, as we are now in this age of Title IX and how these things show up and how, looking at your numbers, all of those things come into play. And so being able to look at what were the root causes of those pieces for me. So that's where it started. And in that, everywhere I've been, there's always been some particular piece of how that comes to play for me. So in the process of, putting a few articles out there, doing presentations about it, and looking at it as a person who probably does not show up on the toxic masculinity scale, it is something that I find very, very interesting as a research topic.
Yes, thank you very much. So as you can probably see, those of you watching, this is a passion area for Dr. Grant. And so we're going to go ahead and dive right in. And can you talk to us a little bit by kind of operationalizing or describing or defining what toxic masculinity is? And really, like, what were some of the things that got you interested in it, and how did you start kind of diving through and researching it?
Okay. Um, the long and short of it, probably another term would be probably hegemonic masculinity. And that's where it's defined, where it legitimizes men's dominant position in society and justifies the subordination of women and other marginalized ways of being a man. And so that shows up for us in a number of ways, such as violence and sex and aggression. We should not be interested in feminine things, because that makes us appear weak. We shouldn't display feminine traits such as emotional vulnerability. The notion that men and women can never really truly understand each other and be friends. And because we as men are always interested in sex, and real men are strong and we don't show emotions, or signs of shame or weakness. Anger and violence are useful in solving conflicts, and men are situated to be are not situated to be single parents and the dominant parent of the family. So I think for me, it started when I would think about some of the experiences that I had as a kid, some of the messages that I got as a kid. For example, I love to cook, and it wasn't because it was time with my mother. It's because I like to eat, and I like to eat what I made. So that's kind of where it started for me. Other things that happened to me, I was really big into gymnastics, cheerleading, music, dance, all of those things because like people in my friends were doing it, and so I got a lot of sexual typing messages around how that was not okay, how I needed to not do those things, how I needed to not participate in those activities. And I remember specifically one time, I was 10 years old. I will never forget this as long as I live. I was climbing the monkey bars doing a stunt and broke my toe. Literally broke the toe, bone coming through, blood gushing, and all of that. You go to the office, they call your parents, and the teacher says, "Don't cry, don't cry." Now I am literally looking at my bone, and so it was just this big, massive pieces. And so in that, I had been labeled, a punk from that moment on. But at that point, I didn't care. It was, I was in pain, and so luckily my parents came and got me. But though it was that type of messaging, and that type of messaging that little boys receive around instances and things where clearly it's okay for you to be vulnerable. So kind of work through those. So looking at those experiences, being able to, how those have translated into my life as a teenager, as a young professional, and even now a little bit more seasoned, how some of those messages show up, how they play out, and what the expectations are around those, and how people are rewarded and punished because they exhibit those traits.
All right. All right. Well, definitely a topic that needs to be dived in further. And I'm glad that you bring this kind of lens and research as well as passion to the table as we think about it as far as our professional lives. And you talk about how people are ignored, like for example, women or are ignored in the workplace, and then being told not to cry when you're literally looking at your bone protruding out of your skin. um, those are like, to a normal person just on surface, you would think that has to be painful. You're going to have some type of reaction to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then ask someone to hold that reaction is, it's like kind of inhumane. like
Mm-hmm.
don't we all have feelings, right? So can you talk about one of the things I'm very interested in is black males specifically, and how we're socialized, and how different images are out there that portray us for how we're supposed to act, who we are, and in many cases it makes some of us believe that we have to live out those different type of tropes and ideals. So can you talk to us about how our black men socialize, around toxic masculinity, and when do they first realize it?
I'll start with the second part first. Um, I think most men, Black men in particular, become familiar with the topic of toxic masculinity when they're little boys. And it's always around some behavior, socially inappropriate or no. We are taught how to behave like little men. We are taught in a lot of places to capture and take ownership of our environment. A lot of times when we disagree, get in arguments, and sometimes fist fights, a lot of times we as young men or little boys are taught to fight to the finish. And in that, I openly admit there were now times where I would come home with a bloody news, those sort of things, and my mother would say, okay, this is the last time this is going to happen. If you come home that way, don't come home. And so in that, I too own that. And so I became a little bit of a scrapper. So, when I would get into those situations, I would fight to the finish, and those sorts of things. It was just, I think it equated shame for parents, or it equated shame for some of the adults in those things. If you weren't able to handle those situations with aggression and those pieces. I, as a kid, was a talker, so I could kind of talk my way out of situations or talk my way through things. But sometimes it didn't work, and then sometimes as I was talking, you get popped in the mouth. And so in that, you kind of have to be able to navigate that and work through those situations. But in that, we have to look at where those messages come from. But it kind of starts in, when we go to our socialization process, all of those things that make us who we are, all of those lessons, all of those rules that we are taught, whether they're quote unquote Black rules or just rules of how we are to be and how to navigate through the world, we are given those rules with the lens that we are to, that violence and aggression are okay. It's not necessarily, it's okay to talk, but there's a certain way that you talk. There is, for those of us who are in counseling and human service, when we do takedown or when we reflect meaning and those sort of things, you aren't supposed to do that. You're just supposed to get your point across, and that's it. And so whatever happens, happens. And so I think for a number of people, or how some people are socialized, they seek to understand, then be understood. And so in that, it doesn't matter. That's not a part of our process. And so in that, we have to understand, how do we walk in those conversations with those lenses and being able to work with that. Our socialization process, or our interactions with women, don't necessarily start as friendships, there are familial relationships, but when we are in our relationships with women, it takes on a almost a romantic, a power struggle, if you will, for a number of folks. So being able to look at how all of these things line up and show up for us, there's an element of toxicity in that. We don't necessarily have to work in those areas. We don't necessarily have to be angry or violent, in ways of solving in terms of solving conflict. It's okay for us to like certain things and be able to demonstrate those things, or to have those gifts and talents. And so being able to kind of work through those is as a part of our socialization process. So I think as we do things and as we come into our own, we have to be cognizant of that, and then use those pieces in terms of our self-affirmation. So that way we are affirming ourselves as men, we are operating in the community as men, we are supporting and lifting each other up where there isn't, a violent undertone to it.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. And earlier, when you talk about the violent undertones, and you talked about toxic masculinity towards women, specifically in the workplace. Can you talk to us about toxic masculinity when it comes to other men, especially Black men, and how it shows up for us as in our professional spaces?
Well, we look for the weak and the vulnerable. We look for that to show up. And that in the workplace, it could be how a person interacts with other people, how they supervise. I'll use myself as an example. I probably have a more egalitarian leadership style. I really try to build consensus among parties and those sort of things. And I remember in an evaluation meeting with my supervisor, who was another man, basically telling me that I needed to stop that. You are the person in charge. It doesn't matter if you get buy-in. And I'm thinking, okay, if I don't get these people's buy-in, they're not going to do what we want them to do. So, and I have to look at that and present that in a way that works for them. And I also have this other thing. I'm an African American man in an all-white environment on the other side of the country. So I have to. I'm looking at all of these tapes and I'm in this evaluative meeting and I'm thinking, okay, I'll take that under advisement. I appreciate the feedback, but as that plays out, I have to be very, very careful how that works. And so in that, I admit I tried it twice. Neither time went well, and staff said, we really do appreciate when you come in and you lay it out for us and you give us the opportunity to choose and you give us the opportunity to dialogue and work through that. And so in that, and one of the women said, that may appear to be very feminine, but in actuality, it really does work. It is a part of the consensus building model, and we really do appreciate you having it. And so while a number of folks may do some form of that, I think how it shows up or how it's perceived doesn't necessarily work. And for me, I was punished. I was not given an opportunity because my supervisor at the time saw that as a weakness and really truly wanted to get that out of me. But the minute that person left the organization and I became the leader, that was my style, and that was the style that people appreciated. And even though it's been a long time since I've been away from that institution, one of the things that they we always appreciated how you talked to us, how you were very respectful of us, how you paid attention to what was going on, how you valued our lives outside of the office, and you talked about those and you remembered those. And even to this day, while we're no longer colleagues, but we're Facebook friends or we see each other at conferences and things, you always remember those pieces and you bring those up in conversation, and we're really appreciative of that. So that in some areas may be viewed as feminine. I view it as probably just being human and connecting with people about common experiences, and so being able to kind of work through that. But I remember being punished for that, and having a female colleague do the exact same thing I did be rewarded. So being able to kind of look at how that plays out, but at the same time, the way that we problem solved. It was about going in and saying, laying down the land, so to speak. And so for me, I was trying to, I need to get all the perspectives. I need to see where people are comfortable. I need to see how things are going to play out. And then as we bring in these nuances or variables that we had in terms of budget and those things, being able to kind of resolve, come to resolution that a lot of people, everybody may not have bought into it, but it was something that people could say, okay, that makes sense. It's the best move for us, and being able to kind of work in that area. So we have to look at, how we operate in the workplace. What are those messages? Then how do those things play out for us? And so, we get messaging around how it is that we respond, how it is that we work with people, how we solve problems. And so being able to kind of work with that. And that in and of itself does centered around toxic masculinity. I mean, I remember times where I was working on my dissertation and having some very interesting conversations with Black male mid-level managers and how frustrated they because the way they operated in the workplace was very different from how they operated at home. And, when they talked about that, some of them admitted that their work in the workplace was probably a little softer than they liked or appreciated. And, but then again, they knew who they were working with and how that would play out. And so it was a part of, quote unquote, playing the game for them. But in actuality, they had talked about those pieces. And so I think in some follow-ups I've done, how has that played out? And one person said, I know you're going to talk to me about toxic masculinity, Jesse. That's just your thing. I was like, well, it is. But in that, how does that play out for you? Did you think your behavior at that time could have been toxic? What was the messaging around that? Where did you learn that it was okay to talk to people in a degrading way in the workplace? And how did that play out for you as a man? How did that play out for you as an African-American man? And then what was the result around that? And, he shared that it wasn't a well resolved. He had been documented and had been investigated and ended up having to leave the organization. But in that, that's how those things show up. And so being able to kind of help navigate and work through that. And, he did admit that, the behavior was probably toxic. And so, probably needed to have some adjustment and some work in some of those areas.
I didn't unmute myself. My apologies.
No worries.
I think it's funny because sometimes people ask me as well, oh, you're going to bring up the diversity and equity question again. And I'm always like, yeah, well, if you know that, why don't you think about it before I get here? So it might be something you want to think about. So we are running out of time. This new format is 30 minutes, but I wanted to just ask one last question before I see if there's any questions out there. If you can maybe try to answer this in 1 minute. I know it's going to sound like not a lot of time, but how does toxic masculinity play out when it comes to sex and sexuality?
Violence and aggression, simply put. I think when we look at how it is that we operate as sexual beings, there is an element of, if you're in a heterosexual relationship, takes the woman and, put her down where it's forceful in some instances, and in some instances looking kind of forceful, and then engaging in activity, and so, when we believe that it should be an experience that is mutually acceptable to both, may not necessarily call for aggression, may call for softness and gentleness in those pieces. So being able to kind of navigate through that. And then for a number of folks, where do we get some of that messaging, or where do we see some of those things? And so we see some of that behavior in the media and in various forms of adult entertainment. And so being able to kind of work through that. And so I don't think anyone's ever asked, is that okay? Is that how you want to be treated during that time? And, for those people who do, I think that's great and wonderful, and you've gotten your information. But for a number of folks, they kind of don't and just kind of roll with it in those pieces. And so being able to kind of look at how it is that we operate, during that time. And remember, relationships are all about negotiation. And if there's one thing that we can negotiate, it's how we operate, during, sexual intimacy, and being able to do that in a way that's beneficial to both of us. So I know a little more than a minute, but I think I got it.
Yes, thank you very much. And so for you all watching, I know I don't have any questions in the chat yet, but please put questions in the chat. And so while we wait a few seconds to see if there's any questions in the chat, I want to ask you a question. and this might be for anyone out there watching or who will watch, when you think about the topic of toxic masculinity, and let's say I don't know anything about it, but what you've said today has piqued my interest a little bit. What resources should I be looking into to begin diving into this topic a little bit more?
I would tell you to look at drax.com, and he has a real cool article, 5 Ways to Stop Toxic Masculinity. It's real short, and it's a 2-3 minute read. It kind of explains what it is in layman's terms, but it also talks about how it is that we can stop those behaviors with real things that we do, and understanding how those things play out on us. I'll give one as an example. When we want someone to take more ownership of something, what is the 2-word phrase that we tell people to do, especially men? We tell them to man up, right? And while in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that, telling someone to man up is basically telling them that their behavior is not up to snuff and they need to do more. So why can't we say, you know what, you got to take more responsibility. There needs to be more leadership in this area. And so being able to kind of work through those pieces. And then I would go and say the same thing when I hear the sisters say, woman up. I mean, you got to take more responsibility. You have to really lead those pieces out. And I think, sometimes when we look at, toxic masculinity, a lot of that centers around language and the impact of language in various situations. Because for us as Black men, the worst thing that we could be called is fag or a sissy or those sorts of things. And is it that we're calling someone a fag or a sissy, or are we talking about someone who is exhibiting behaviors that are feminine, and being able to differentiate that and work through those things? And so how do we do that in a way to where we are being, helpful? Because I think that's genuinely what we want to do, but at the end of the day, we end up causing more harm and being able to work through that. And then one of the things that, that I know was probably going to cause some questions, I think for a lot of men, the gender of the people who give those messages are women. That's not how a man acts. You ain't a man, you know what I mean? And so a lot of those things, and so no disrespect to sisters, but we have to be very, very careful. How do we say that, and how do we want that to fall? Now, some people want it to fall where they are hurting people's masculinity, they are challenging them, and I think there's a way to challenge behaviors without going in and making assumptions about a person's personhood and how they see and navigate the world. Because when we do that, we end up doing more harm than good. And well, it's just a little nudge. I just want him to be a little straighter, be a little tougher, and those sorts of things. I think, but there's a way to say that and not debase them in the process. And I think sometimes when we do that, we end up debasing people in the process. I mean, I think for a number of us, I can think of a lot of mine in school. I can think of a lot of mine in school with a particular teacher. It was just, this teacher did not like how I did anything. I mean, and so was, very adamant, parent-teacher conferences, all of that about my behavior. And my mother had to say, okay, you haven't said anything about how my son is doing academically in your class. She goes, well, he's doing great. So this was about other stuff. And so, I thank my mother, for standing up and advocating for me at that point in time. But I think for a number of us, we may not necessarily have people like that. But, those things show up. Those tapes play loudly. And so you have to be able to look at how it is that we work through and how we navigate that. And then how do we work through that? So we need to share the truth about, gender research and those sorts of things, because there's a school of thought that says men's brains and women's brains are different. Not that much. I mean, there are some things physiologically that are different, but in terms of thinking capacity, being able to, those things are the same. Being able to discuss gender roles and what that means. So being able to, realistically talk about that. And so, when a boy says he wants to be a secretary and a woman says that she wants to be president, that's okay. Being able to understand how those things play out. So we have to look at all of those things. So.
Yeah. And I think you answered Diana Autry's question. She says she loves you, by the way. And she basically asked, do you think women unconsciously play a role in reinforcing toxic masculinity? I think you shared an answer to that. And I think you might even have answered the question from Richard, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just in case it sparks a 30-second response. How do you think that we as Black men can help end the trend of toxic masculinity among us and within our community?
That's a good question, Richard. So let me give you a few tips and pointers. We have to be really honest about what masculinity is and what masculinity isn't. We have to look at how the messages that we are taught, and a number of them, we have to deconstruct them, because it's okay that some things happen the way they happen. I'll give one that people say isn't, but it kind of is. Men who like to cook, okay? Just like I said earlier in the talk, I like to cook because I like to eat. But those men who like to cook, have there's this big stigma around that, and so we have to really truly look at those things and be honest about what those pieces are, and be able to talk in real space, in real time, and say, things that we don't know. We don't know the answer. Find the resources to the answer. But, being able to, highlight positive elements of masculinity, being able to talk about those things, in our community that we may not necessarily understand, but it's us doing well, and being able to kind of talk about that and celebrate that in a way to where people understand that and see that and can work through that and have those real genuine conversations about what that is, and then talk about dating. In heterosexual relationships, there is clearly a male role and a female role, and those things sometimes shift. And and as I said, relationships are all about negotiation. So being able to understand how those things play out and how to be an effective partner, how communication is a great and wonderful thing, how communication is an aphrodisiac if you do it right, and being able to navigate those pieces in those relationships. So those are a few things, Richard, that, I would begin to, have you talk about what those pieces are. But, looking at, various resources, I talked about the Dr. Axe article because it was, real short. But, if you go to YouTube, there are tons of videos where they're talking about the topic and looking at it from a number of different places, sex and sexuality, crime, education, and those pieces. So, feel free to check out those resources as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Grant, for being on the show today and sharing your perspectives on this topic. I just want to say that I share your love of cooking. I've been, I was in second grade when I first said I wanted to go to a cooking class. They had the after school cooking thing, and I was the only guy in the class. And my teacher asked me, "You sure you don't want to do one of those sports things that all the other guys?" I'm like, "No, I want to learn how to cook. Cooking is what I want to do." And if any of my friends are out there watching, you will probably want to thank my cooking teacher, because I have gotten nothing but great rave reviews on my cooking. So I'm just saying, man can't cook.
I'll say the same thing. I had a similar experience, and in our families there are certain dishes that we make for the holiday meal. Okay, so I'll say, okay,
yes.
no.
Mine is mac and cheese.
Mine is turkey. Done. So No,
Okay.
and people will
But you
have
know,
an
the
attitude.
turkey. If you talk about toxic masculinity, let's go there real quick. The turkey is the most manliest thing on the menu. It's it's
Yes,
like it's the masculine thing. We got
it
who's
is.
gonna carve the
It's the
turkey? Daddy gonna
thing
carve
that
the turkey.
makes the turkey. Well, I don't carve the turkey. I make the turkey, but then again, I gotta make the sweet potato pound cake. I gotta make the peach cobbler. I gotta make the red velvet cake with the bourbon, with the cream cheese bourbon frosting. So I mean, there are those things that, hey, and that's just how the Grant family rolls. Okay, but,
Right. I know that's right. Shakita just said that I can cook in real life. I'm like, well, what life was we talking about? Well, thank you again, Dr. Grant. We are at our
sure,
time. As always, this is we could talk about these topics for many longer minutes than we have, but I just want to really give Black men an opportunity to share their perspectives so you can hear their voices and our solutions to some of the common problems and situations that we are dealt in society. This is episode 14. We have we're slated to have 22 episodes. I will be doing a call out for more panelists for guests that will be coming out this week. So if you know someone who would want to be in one of those last 5 episodes, please let us know. We do have I have one special guest that I have planned that I think I'm gonna do the last episode with. And then we'll take a small break and hiatus for the season and come back when it's snowing outside, unfortunately. Well, it'll be snowing here because it's Ohio, so it could snow tomorrow, actually, thinking about Ohio. But anyway, so we want to just make sure if you have anybody, please forward them to me, njakbar@icloud.com, or you can just message me right here in the Perspectives with Black Men Facebook page. I also want to tell you that our research on Black perspectives on racism, which basically came out of this show, is out. So please take it. Please send it to your friends. Tell them if you have 10 minutes, which we all should be able to take 10 minutes and do the survey. Heck, this might not be a popular opinion, but most of us take our phones to the bathroom to do the survey while you are using the restroom. Why not? I mean, 10 minutes is all it takes. Just find the time, please. Help us with research, and so that we can push some of our solutions as Black people to the right hands. And last but not least, I had 2 things. Sorry. One, we also started our YouTube channel, so you go ahead and go to YouTube, follow us on YouTube. Every episode after it airs gets uploaded onto YouTube, so you can watch it and all the other 13 other episodes. This is the 14th, so there's 13 before this one. Episodes on YouTube. You can share it with your friends there as well. So we have that. And last but not least, I'm really, really excited to bring on Askia Talib Dean, who will be here next Sunday at 8:30 Eastern Standard Time to talk about his experience being incarcerated and then coming out of prison and trying to get a job and getting an education. And no matter how much education he has gotten, which he's a doctoral candidate right now, he has had issues getting jobs and have been stereotyped. So he's going to talk about our problem with our correction. Well, it's not really a correctional system, but what should be a correctional system that does not benefit Black men. And he'll talk about that in his research on fully incarcerated men. I'm really excited to hear him as well. And he found us by just someone sharing our show, and he watched it from their page and had messaged me and shared his story with me. So again, share these episodes, because you never know, it might speak to somebody and they may want to be able to share their story, and that's what this platform is for. So without further ado, I always like to end this and give proper credit to Tabitha Brown, who is one of my favorite social media influencers. She says you have a great day, and if you're not gonna have a great day, don't go around and mess up someone else's. I think I got it wrong this time, but just don't mess up anybody else's day if you can't have a good one. All right, everybody, have a good day, and thank you again, Dr. Grant, for being here with us.
My pleasure.